And next thing I know, I found myself standing inside a clearing, about 25, 30-foot radius. I was standing inside on one end, and there was a narrow pathway that uh, went through clear, and beyond into the thicket of the forest beyond, went through that clearing. And I sensed that I was not on earth, but I was in some spiritual realm, perhaps a spiritual way station or something. And that path was trodden like many other people had been there before. And as I came into that space, it was like, oh my gosh, my prayer's really been answered. Here I am. And I felt the separation from my body, literal separation. And so I knew that God had answered my prayer. And he could have answered my prayer, like I said, any other way, but he chose to answer it this way. And I felt this incredible love in that space beyond words.
I'm here today with Russell Ricks, who had a near death like experience when he was just 8 years old that shifted his entire paradigm. Russell, thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to meet you.
Thank you. I'm pleasure to meet you as well and happy to share my story.
And thank you for doing that as well. That's very helpful for so many people. I appreciate that beyond words. So, tell me your story. This happened when you were just practically a baby.
Yeah, I was 8 years old, and I will share with you an experience that did happen to me along with this, that when I was practically a baby. Um, I I need to let the audience know that I was born with a neurological disability, and I also was born with hearing loss, and so I have two disabilities. And they, at the time when I had this experience that relates to my story, uh, or that my disabilities relate to my story, my experience. At the time, I didn't know, I couldn't understand why I was struggling socially, why my peers were progressing way above me, and I was so far behind. Um, I didn't understand until I was 50 years old through an MRI scan. I found out that I have complete agenesis of the corpus callosum. And what agenesis means is something is not normal. And I have complete agenesis, meaning I was born without the corpus callosum part of my brain, and yet I'm high functioning. Now, to explain what the corpus callosum is, sometimes that's hard to say. It's kind of a tongue twister. Um, it sits in the middle between your left and right hemisphere, and it provides an information superhighway between both hemispheres. So information can travel quickly from one side or the other, wherever it needs to process. I was born without that. But while the brain was still forming in the womb, it recognized that the corpus callosum would not form because spinal fluid blocked it and kept it from forming. I had too much spinal fluid. And so it tried to make up for it. The brain is very plastic, and it tried to make up for it and created random connections called Probst bundles and made up for most of it, but left some quirks. And one of those quirks, those of us that have this disability, there's like one in every 4,000 people approximately, or are in the spectrum of that. Autism is part of it, part of the spectrum, and other neurological disabilities. Um, um, so that about one in every 4,000 people have this disability, and they tend to have severe social delay. And so I was held back. My parents recognized that I was not advancing. It wasn't that I wasn't smart. I'm very smart, but on the social end, I was not really advancing, and my parents could see that. So I didn't go to kindergarten. And then when I was age 7, and I was one of the older kids in my class, my parents put me in first grade, and that first grade year was horrible. I Every day I suffered abuse from my peers. I would try to make a friend, and I would say something that offended them somehow, and I didn't understand that I was offending them. I was just trying to make a friend, and it would backfire on me, and I'd end up getting teased or beat up. during recess, I was always the last one picked, if I was picked at all, to be on a team to play some type of game. No one wanted me on their team. And in class, my first grade teacher was several times a week, she would bust a yardstick over my head or some part of my body. I'm left-handed and I'm stubborn, and she was trying to force me to be right-handed, and I would say, no, this is my right hand, and I'd hold up my left hand and say, because I write with it. And whack, 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 and I think that kind of also set the example for my other peers to give them license to tease me. And it was awful, the abuse that, and I know kids can be cruel, and they have these experiences, but eventually they grow out of it. I struggled with this up until the 10th grade. In my 10th grade year, um, a kid half my height said, I'm going to beat you up after school. Meet me at such and such a place. And he brought the school bully. And so the school bully was the one who beat me up, and he nearly sent me to a hospital. And my thinking was, you know, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to fight to the death if I have to. This is an unfair fight. The bully finally said, "Say, uncle," and I said, "No, this is an unfair fight. I'm not quitting." And he got up and walked away. So the next day, the school was saying that I won the fight because I stood up to the bully, and after that, people just kind of left me alone. But at the age of 8, when I had my experience that I'm going to share, I also started painting. My father was a sign painter, and he eventually went into fine art, so he would paint every day. And I got into painting as a young man, and that's really what saved me. I would escape to my art when I was feeling these social fears. And anyway, so at the age of 8 years old, um, I knew in a few weeks, my birthday's in July, and I knew in a few weeks I'd have to go back to school. And I begged my parents, please don't let me go to school. I'm going to get a little emotional. I apologize. Don't let me go to school. I don't want to face that again. And Dad says, oh, you just got to be tough. And they said, well, it's the law. We don't have a choice. You have to go. And I saw that I couldn't get out of it and that way, but I was determined to find a way so I wouldn't have to deal with that abuse somehow. I thought about running away, and I thought, no, that's not a good idea. But at bedtime, um, I remember laying on my bed, pondering on an experience that I had. It was either a few days or a few weeks earlier. It's been a long time. I can't remember. But how long ago? But just before my experience, I I'm a I'm a Latter-day Saint from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and in my faith, we believe that children are innocent at birth, and they have no need of baptism until they become accountable, until they gain a basic understanding of right and wrong. And we believe, and experts say, that that's around the age of 8 years old when you start to get a sense of basic right and wrong. And so we're baptized at that age. And I had just been baptized. And I remember laying in bed a few days later, laying on my bed thinking that during my baptism, I felt something there, something special. And I decided that what I felt was God or God's Spirit. And then I reflected back to an experience that I had even earlier in my youth. My mother, um, we grew up in a home where my father would paint and my mom would sing. And my mom had a professionally trained high soprano voice. She even studied in Hollywood and auditioned before Warner Brothers, and they were going to hire her as an extra. But when they said, you have to be 100% with your acting and singing career, family takes a back burner. Mom said, never mind. She was 19 at the time, not married. She decided to go back to Idaho, where she grew up, Idaho Falls. And I grew up in Rexburg, 30 miles from Idaho Falls. She decided to she was going to go to BYU in Utah, but then something said, go to Rick's College in Rexburg, Idaho, and where my father was from, and he was at school at the time. And eventually, my parents met and married and raised 7 children. And I grew up in a home where Dad would paint every day and Mom would sing nearly every day. And she sang like an angel. Both my parents are passed away now. So anyway, I remember a period of time. It seemed like it had lasted 3 or 4 months, and I was not old enough to form sentences, because I remember being frustrated trying to get my family's attention. Who are these people dressed in white who are coming into our home, surrounding Mom when she sings to us every day? And after many years later, I decided that maybe they were my deceased family, deceased ancestors. Well, so there I was laying in bed thinking about what I felt at my baptism and that experience that I had when I was much younger. And I never shared that experience with anybody until my second wife, not even my first wife. My first wife, I shared my near death like experience. But this part about these spirits coming into our home, I kept to myself until I shared it with my second wife. And this was just a few months before my mom passed away. And then I shared it with my mom. That really meant a lot to my mom to hear that. Anyway, I was thinking about those two experiences, and I thought, well, if what I felt at my baptism was God's Spirit, and what I experienced when I was much younger, if these were spirits from heaven, then God has to be real. And if anyone could answer my prayer to somehow get me out of this mess of having to go back to school and face this abuse, God can answer my prayer. And so I got on the side of my bed to kneel and pray. And believe me, all I wanted was an answer to my prayer. And God could have answered my prayer any way he chose, but he chose to do it in a very special, personal way. He said, I got on my knees and I said, Heavenly Father, I know you have to be real because of what I experienced and what I felt. And so if anyone can get me out of this mess, I know you can. You've either got to take this abuse away, um, or take me away somehow. That's the only way I think I can get out of it. And I have just been baptized, and so my slate's been wiped clean, I was thinking. So now's the perfect time to go. And I said, I know it's wrong for me to take my life, but if you take me, then it's okay. And I begged him to take me. And I climbed on top of my bed and cried. And then I had this a feeling of, you know, before I fell asleep, it was like this feeling of blacking out. The room started to spin, the bed started to spin. And the next thing I know, I found myself floating on my back near the ceiling, um, above my bed. And then I thought, man, this is weird. And I turned and I could see myself down in bed asleep. And here I was yet, um, above my bed, um, near the ceiling. And I thought, man, this is weird. How could I be two places at once? That can't be possible. But yet, it feels so real. I thought, well, I must be having a conscious dream or something. And then this tiny bright light appeared and grew bigger and drew towards me, and I felt this love coming from it. And like a magnet, I was being pulled into that light. And I thought, well, this is a conscious dream. I'm not going to pinch myself and wake myself up. I'm just going to go with it. And then, as I was drawn into this light, there was no sense of time. It seemed like I traveled up into the stars, past planets. I traveled a great distance. And then, as I drew closer to that light, I saw a planet for me, um, shrouded in clouds, and the clouds began to part. and open up, and I found myself coming down high on a mountaintop into a forest garden. Um, and next thing I know, I found myself standing inside a clearing about 25, 30-foot radius. I was standing inside on one end, and there was a narrow pathway that uh, went through clear, and beyond into the thicket of the forest beyond, went through that clearing. And I sensed that I was not on earth, but I was in some spiritual realm, perhaps a spiritual way station or something. And that path was trodden like many other people had been there before. And as I came into that space, it was like, oh my gosh, my prayer's really been answered. Here I am. And I felt the separation from my body, literal separation. And so I knew that God had answered my prayer. And he could have answered my prayer, like I said, any other way, but he chose to answer it this way. And I felt this incredible love in that space beyond words. And then, and then at the same time, I recognized, I came to the realization that my time there was only temporary and that I would have to go back. I still felt a connection to my body, like a conduit or something was still between my body and my spirit, even though we were miles apart, um, and seemingly. And um, so I sensed that I would have to go back, and I thought, well, I'm just going to soak up as much as I can before I go. So I put it out of my mind. And while I was in that clearing, uh, I felt this incredible love beyond words. I saw colors that I had never seen before. And I can't describe them because we don't have the color palette here. So how can you? That's like trying to describe salt to someone who's never tasted salt. How would you describe that? And being an artist and starting to paint at 8 years old, that intrigued me. Um, and then I saw colors on I saw varieties of flowers that I had never seen with colors that I had never seen on flowers. And I also um, noticed that the plant life, each whether it was a blade of grass or a flower or leaves on the tree itself, the sky, the birds, everything seemed to have its own vibration, individual vibration, and together the vibrations together created this harmonious heavenly music. Have you ever heard of theremin? The musical instrument theremin?
Oh, yes, I've heard of that. It's beautiful.
It was kind of that sound. And think of all these different, let's say there's a orchestra of theremins playing together. That's kind of what it sounded like to me. And it was just incredible. And I could hear angelic voices singing in the background, but I didn't see any angelic beings. I also felt the presence of my deceased ancestors, that they were there. I didn't see them, but I felt their presence and their awareness of me. And they were rooting for me and praying for me. So I felt their support. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to walk down into the thicket of the forest and see what else I can discover. Oh, and before I did that, I experienced the creation. I witnessed it from the beginning to the end. It was like I was there at that moment, and it just seemed so real. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I'm smart. Yeah, I'm only 8 years old, and I'm smarter than the scientists back on Earth. I can't wait to go back and tell them what I've. And then, of course, when I returned, it was all blocked out. But I had this sense of this spiritual download that was beyond words. And I began to walk down this path. I was going to go through the pathway into the thicket of the forest to discover what I could. And on the other side, to the left of that path, at the edge of the clearing on the other side, was a large boulder about a dulcet weight high, and there was a tighter group of aspen behind that boulder, and one in particular had this huge aspen trunk. And I sensed something symbolic from that aspen that I didn't understand the meaning of now, but I think I understand better. It was like a tree of life. And from coming from my faith, the tree of life represents the love of God, which is Jesus Christ. And Also, if you don't know this about aspens, aspens aren't a single root system. They are a communal root system. That means there's one big living organism that shoots up sprigs that become these tall aspen trees, and they're all a part of each other. And I thought, what an interesting symbol that is, because it's like this oneness. You feel this incredible oneness when you're in that space. And so this aspen tree, which was a tree of life, also symbolized this oneness. And I sense that the root system was my deceased, was symbolic of my deceased ancestors who were there to support me. And so when we come here to Earth, I believe that we're not alone. Not only do we have uh, God who is aware of us, our ancestors who are passed on, they are aware of us, and perhaps they might even be our guardian angels from time to time. That's my personal belief. So I proceeded to walk down this pathway, and just before I stepped out of the clearing, a voice said, "Stop. This is the point of no return. If you go any further, you'll have no choice but to go back to mortality." And I didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave that space. I felt safe and secure and loved. Not that I didn't feel love from my parents' family. I did. But as a little boy, from what I experienced outside of my family life, it was a cruel and abusive world. And I didn't want to go back to that. I didn't want to have to face that again at school. And, or even at church with my own peers. Anyway, so I just dropped on my knees inside that clearing and leaned up against that boulder, put my hands to my face, and began to sob. And a few moments later, there was this touch on my right shoulder and a voice, "Russell, what's the matter? Why are you crying?" And I thought to myself, who's this person that knows my name? And I turned to look, and I saw this personage with long white hair down to his shoulders and a white beard. And he had a long white flowing robe, and he appeared to be standing above the ground, just a few inches off the ground. And there was this light brighter than the sun emanating from him. And in my 8-year-old description, not knowing scriptures that I discovered later in my adulthood, his eyes appeared to be on fire, and yet they are not. And it was like you could, as you look into his eyes, you could see eternity, and he could read your soul. And you felt this, the love that I felt in that garden space was beyond words. And then when this personage appeared, it was 100 times more in his presence, and 1,000, maybe a million times more. I don't know how to describe it, but you could definitely feel that from him. And before I knew who he was, before I saw the wounds in his hands, his wrists, and his feet, and his side, I I knew who he was. That's what I meant to say. And um, he, I just felt this complete love from him, and and he looked into my soul and read my soul, and I had no fear because I knew that I could trust him, and that he loved me beyond words. And he could sense that something was really bothering me. And he reached down to pick me up and take me to his bosom. And as he reached down, his robe fell open a little bit, and I could see the wound in his side. And now I want to stop right here and say, I believe that God gives each of us experiences that he knows that's for us individually, that he knows we need at that time. Each of us that have these near-death like experiences, we come from different backgrounds. Some of us come from different religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds. Some of us may not come from a religious background, but yet maybe have some sense of moral beliefs, basic right and wrong, or so on. I believe that God takes us where we're at with the understanding that we have and gives us an experience that relates to us personally. And so thus we have And I believe that the near-death experience, that they have these these similarities in this pattern. I believe that that pattern is God's handprint that says, this is this comes from me. And some might call him universe or whatever, but that's the handprint. But everyone, but other than those similarities, everyone has an individual experience. It's because that is exactly what we need. And I also believe that some NDEers might say that this is what heaven is like exactly, but I believe that some of it might be literal, but some of it also very symbolic. But it's symbolic with a meaning that has something to do that will that's meaningful for you. And if you don't understand what it means at that moment, eventually, sometime in your life, it will begin to form. And so God answers our prayer in a way that it's meaningful to us, or he gives us these experiences, spiritual experiences that are what we need at that time. And so I may be criticized by some people for sharing, and I have been, for sharing my experience coming from my Christian perspective. But this is the raw experience that God gave me. So just understand that this one's for me. I'm not saying this is what it's like for everybody else, and you have to believe what I believe. That's not what I'm saying at all. And so, anyway, so he picked me up and took me in and put embraced me in his arms, and I noticed that there was this city of light in the distance, in the atmosphere above us, and in a pillar of light, we transported to that city, and it again, no sense of time, but it seemed like we traveled for a great deal of time. And eventually, as we arrived near this city, I could this light was emanating from it, and I failed to mention, while I was in that garden space, the plant life, with each of its vibration, also swayed in rhythm to that music that it was creating together. And I sensed also that the vibrations were praising God for the purpose of their creation, continuously praising God. The light that was coming from this distant city was doing the same thing. And uh, as we drew closer to the city, it appeared that it was a city of gold. And the streets were paved in gold, the wall around the city was gold, and all the buildings were gold. And coming from my religious background, two buildings look very familiar. And if we have time for me to share this, it has significance later in my story, coming from my religious perspective, that confirmed what happened to me was from God. Um, anyway, one building, if you've ever been to the LDS Temple Square in Salt Lake City, one building looked like the architectural structure of the Salt Lake Temple, and the other one looked like the Mormon Pioneer Tabernacle, and only gold. And I was brought into this building that was like the tabernacle and sat down on one of the pews. And the Savior pulled me close, put his arm around me, and said, "Russell, let's talk about it. What's going on? What's wrong?" And I said, "This is my home, and I just want to stay here. I know I have to go back, but why can't I stay?" Um, and the Savior said, "Well, you have things to do." And I said, but I was just baptized. My slate's clean. What if when I do go back? What if when it is my time to die and come back home? Um, what if I've messed up so bad that I can't come back here? It just seems like the perfect time to me. And the Savior chuckled and said, "Ross, oh, you don't need to worry about that. I've already taken care of that." That I allowed my life to be marred. Allowed my body to be marred because I love you, and like I love all your brothers and sisters. And because I did that, all you have to do is believe in me, follow me, be a good boy, and everything will be all right. I'll see you again. And then he said, it was almost like having an experience at that moment, an interview with Christ at that moment, and before I was born. And I believe that each of us, before we come to earth, I believe that we were taught the lessons of life, what it would be like in mortality, but we hadn't experienced it in a body. And so we were schooled on our purpose on earth. And but when it was our time to come to earth, we were filled with so much anxiety because we had never done that before. We had never been in a body, and it was something new. And so I believe that Christ Himself gives us that final interview. Um, and it was like I was re-experiencing that interview before I was born, and then also experiencing a moment with Christ at that time in my life as an 8-year-old. He said, Russ, because of what you've done here in this life, you will be born into a good family with good parents who will teach you about me and about my gospel. And you will have a strong belief in the scriptures and, in God's word and in the prophets. And, after my experience, the only thing I had at the time, this was 1966, Raymond's Moody's book, Life After Life, came out, I think 1975, something like that, almost 10 years later. So the only thing I had to relate to try to understand what happened in me was the scriptures. And I found some interesting things that were relatable in the scriptures. And, but when I read Raymond Moody's book in my teens, it was like, oh my gosh, this happened to me. And then I read others. And, but I still kind of believe that it was a dream because I didn't die. And then later in my life, I understand it was what they call an out of body experience, where my spirit did indeed separate. And anyway, so uh, he made these promises, said, because of what you've done here, you're going to have these things on earth. And um, then he said, it's time for you to go back. And he said, are you ready? And I didn't really want to go, but I put my trust in what the Savior's promised. And he said, there's one more thing I want to tell you before you go. I promise you that I will always be by your side, and I will let you know from time to time that I'm there. I will let you know personally, and especially when things get really hard, I will be right by your side, and you will know. And then we went back to that place, that garden space where my experience basically began. He set me down on the pathway where I first stood, and we embraced, and he kind of gave me a little tug on the back, and I walked down that path into the thicket of the forest, and then it got darker and darker, and then I found myself awake in bed, um, and it was light. So the experience apparently happened the whole of the night, but honestly, it seemed like it lasted days or maybe weeks. I'm not sure, but it was, and I just laying there like, oh my gosh, this really did happen to me. This was amazing, and I was still feeling the bliss from that experience. In fact, it continued with me. Seemed like 24/7 for the next several months afterwards, and I believe that God gave that to me um, as I would readjust back into the world and have to face. I went to school, I faced that abuse, but I had one thing that I didn't have before, and that was I knew that I had God's promise, and I knew that He would be there by my side. And um, I believe that in the beginning, that was His way, having that feeling, just like I felt in His space, in the spiritual realm. Having that feeling stay with me was God's way in the beginning of saying, I'm right here. I promised you that I would be by your side, and I want to reassure you that it'll be okay. Well, at breakfast time, I my family gathered to eat breakfast, and after breakfast was done, all my siblings left. I had 6 other siblings, and my my mom was clearing the table, and I started sharing my experience with her. And then she immediately stopped what she was doing and sat down by my side and listened. And after I got done sharing that with her, I said, Mom, what does it mean? She goes, I don't know, but it was from God. I can tell you that it was from God. And she said, someday you'll understand. Years later, I went through that abuse. I went through that abuse in school, and I remember being so frustrated that my peers were advancing socially, and I just was stuck. I just couldn't seem to advance, and I didn't understand why. Um, and at the age of 50, I became aware that through an MRI scan, because my youngest son, I'm remarried. I have 7 children of my own, and after my first marriage ended, I met and married a woman with 7 children, and so we have 14 together. And one of the things that the Savior promised me is I would have a large family. Well, guess what? And I'm not a polygamist. Anyway, my youngest son, when he was 13 years old, he came to stay with me for a few weeks to help me on an art project. I actually did a mural for the Cabela store in East Hartford, Connecticut, and my 2 youngest sons came and helped me on that for a few weeks. And when my his brother, just older than him, stayed for a few months, but Jason had to go back after 3 weeks. When we sat down and were together alone, he shared with me something he had never shared all those years before. He told me that his mother, who was a registered nurse, took him into an MRI scan when he was going through first grade because he was having trouble in school, some learning stuff in the beginning, and he'd get beat up, he'd get teased. And I put my arm around him and I said, Jason, I know your story. This happened to me when I was a kid. I completely understand. And so when he went back home, I said to my wife, you know what, Sammy, I'll bet my wife's name is Karen, her last name Samuelson, but I call her Sammy. I says, you know, Sammy, um, maybe it's genetic. Maybe, maybe I have this disability. And my wife thought, oh, I think so, because she could recognize that I had some issues socially. And so we decided to have me go in for an MRI scan. I didn't have insurance at the time, so it took a couple of years before I was able to secure the funds. Sure enough, that's what I had, was that same disability that he had. And it's like all these questions were finally answered. And, you know, God always answers prayers, but sometimes those answers don't come immediately. I did get an immediate answer, but then part of that, but only part of that, the other part of that wasn't until I was 50 years old. Then it was like, oh my gosh, now I understand. What a relief. And then I went online to see if I could find some kind of help. And I found a study at University of California in San Francisco on the corpus callosum, disabilities of it. I became a guinea pig for 3 days at that university, where they hooked me up to a bunch of machines, and they did a neuropsych exam and so on. I took that information back to Utah, where I live now, found 2 therapists, specialists. Neither one of them had ever worked with someone like me, but they had the understanding of the brain. And one was a clinical neuropsychologist, and the other one was a speech therapist. The speech therapist was to help me with my processing speed and comprehension and so on like that. And that's one of the issues that I've had to deal with. So they worked with me for 2 years and basically taught me how to communicate as an adult. And it was after that when I'd have to have a second job other than my art career, I could finally hold down a job, whereas before it would only last a few weeks or a few months, and then they'd say, "You're not catching on quick enough. We have to let you go." That was always so frustrating. But finally, I was able to get the help I needed and was holding down jobs. Um, well, let me go back to my first marriage. So I was uh, being a Latter-day Saint. I was married in a Latter-day Saint temple, and we believe in our faith that marriages are can be sealed for time and all eternity, not just here in mortality. But it has to be done. The ordinance has to be done in this temple, in a LDS temple. And so the nearest temple at the time, uh, we lived in Rexburg, where I grew up, and she grew up, was in Idaho Falls. And several, it didn't happen when we first went through and got married, but several years later, I and part of the reason why I didn't have that experience then, well, the big reason is because part of that mural was covered up. They dropped the ceiling, a mural that was painted on the wall in what's called the Celestial Room. They dropped the ceiling down about 18 inches, then it covered up an important part of this mural that had I seen it when I first got married and went through the temple, it was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. But it was like 6 years later, they decided to restore that mural in the Celestial Room of the Idaho Falls Temple. And inside the temple, it talks about um, our purpose here in life, beginning with the Garden of Eden, and then the world in which we now live, and then the last room, the Celestial Room that we enter, is called this Celestial Room, and it represents what uh, heaven might be like, what God's kingdom might be like, an artist's rendition. Well, so 6 years later, I walk into the Celestial Room. The men come in, enter on one side. The women enter on another, in another entry doorway. I turned around and sat down on a chair in the middle of the room, and I noticed for the first time, painted between where the men and women come in on the wall was a cluster of aspen trees with a boulder in front and a pathway next to it. And this was right next to two openings, like a portal, the world in which we now live, or mortality, and then in heaven. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's familiar. And I turned around and looked the opposite side. There were two sealing rooms where we are sealed for time and all eternity, kneel at an altar. And in between those two rooms, painted on the wall, was a similar scene. And then I'm looking around. I look in the upper right-hand corner. There's a city in clouds. Um, and the buildings in this city were painted to appear as if they were gold. And two buildings were in the shape of the Salt Lake Temple and the Tabernacle. And it's like, wait a minute, this is not a coincidence. I've got to understand what this experience I had means. And then I turned and looked to my left, and there was on the wall was painted as if they were spirits in heaven. So there was a woman sitting down in grass that looked like my mother in her early 20s, and then she was listening to a couple that was standing up, and that were probably in their 30s, and a couple next to them that were sitting. And the couple standing up looked like my mom's parents when they were younger, and my mom's parents sitting when they were older. And this was just so personal, that wasn't part of my experience that I had, but this mural was so personal. And it was like, God is keeping his promise. He would let me know from time to time that he was there, and here he is. And I thought, well, while I'm in the temple, I've got to understand what that experience I had years ago means. So I found the temple president in his office, and I asked if I could come in and share an experience with him, and he invited me to sit down. So I shared what I shared with you today, uh, including that experience I had when I was even younger with the spirits that would come into our home. And when I finished, I said, I believe that the artist, Lee Green Richards from Utah, I believe that he was inspired. And the temple president looked me in the eyes and said, Brother Ricks, I want you to know first that yes, the artist was inspired. And second, I want you to know that you're not the first persons that come to us with that experience. because of this mural. Other people have had a similar experience. And I says, oh, really? Who are they? I can't give you that information. And I says, I understand, but what does it mean? He says, I don't know, but when the time's right, you'll understand. Years later, after my first marriage ended, the time came to do a change of scenery. The Spirit of the Lord led me to Utah. I literally one night praying on my knees the night before my divorce ended. I thought my life was over because I couldn't be with my kids 24/7 anymore. And I didn't want to put distance between my kids and I. But the Spirit that night before the divorce said, your life isn't over. There's plan B. I have something waiting for you in Utah. And then briefly, I I didn't get face recognition, but I saw this woman with white hair and blue eyes, flash just like that, and it was gone. And she seemed to have a kind of a stressed look on her face. She was a single mom with 7 kids. Of course, she was stressed. Anyway, um, I moved to Utah 2 years later, and eventually met this woman, and we married. But so when I came to Utah, um, many years later, uh, for about 5 or 6 years, I just kept getting this prompting. You have to do more with your story. Um, you need to share your story. And this was not something that I wanted to share with the world. This was too personal, sacred, really. And but finally, I sat down and wrote it down, and then I approached Cedar Fort Publishing, and they said, "We think you have a story here. We think this could make a book." So my book, Remember a Little Boy's Near-Death Experience, was published. I know it's backwards on screen. Um, and a year after it was published, I was invited to a IANS chapter in Salt Lake where I was the guest speaker. And after I finished my story and I shared this experience in the Idaho Falls Temple, an individual came up to me afterwards and said, many years ago, someone shared an, a story so identical to your Idaho Falls Temple mural experience. It was almost like perfectly identical. And I said, so that confirmed to me what the temple president said, that other people have had that experience. I said, well, I want to meet this guy. Who is he? He said, oh, that happened a long time ago, many decades ago. So he's probably dead now. I can't even remember who he was. But at least it confirmed to me that, um, you know, it was almost like, these near-death experiencers who die and come back. They say, well, this and this and this happened when I was dead. I can't do that because I had an out-of-body experience, but I can confirm with, beyond coincidence what happened to me afterwards.
What an incredible story. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. It's so heartwarming and touching and tear jerking at the same time. My heart goes out to that little boy when you were a child for all
Yeah.
that bullying. I'm so
And
glad that times are changing. I think that's recognized a lot more and they're taking action to stop that before it happens. But back then it wasn't. And I'm so sorry that you had to endure that.
well, um, I'm not disappointed in the fact that God made me who I am, the way I am, because I believe that we come here for a purpose, and we come here to learn lessons of life, and that's the only thing we can take back with us. Really, I believe that what what we come here to do has something to do with what happens after we pass on. And so there is a scripture in my faith that, if I can quote it, um, the more intelligence you gain in this life uh, will give you so much more the advantage in the world to come. And so um, we come here to learn lessons, and those lessons make us stronger. They either make us or they break us, really. And we come here with with our agency to choose. And I believe that God wants us to choose to follow him. But he gives us our agency. And if we choose wrong, that's a lesson. If we choose right, that's a lesson. And we take those experiences back with us. And that's the person who we are. And so I was born with my disability for a reason. And maybe one of those reasons is because I needed to be there for my son. I also have 3 grandchildren who are autistic, and I can relate, to them. And so I needed to come before. Um, and I also believe that God made me the way I am to teach me to be more compassionate, more understanding, and have more empathy for people who go through these kind of struggles. And in fact, a couple years after my book, or a couple years after my book was published, I did a podcast. This woman was the host was in New Zealand, like we're doing now, and someone in New Zealand heard my story live. And before she got on the internet and heard me share my story, she was thinking that life was pretty not worth it. She may have been having suicidal thoughts. I don't know. It, um, 2 years later, she found me on social media. She says, "Are you the Russell Ricks that had that near death like experience?" And I says, "Yes, I am." She says, "Well, I want you to know that I had an experience, a near death like experience. It was just really short, but I had one when I was about 8 years old." And she said, "I also want you to know that I was born with complete agenesis of the corpus callosum, and your story gave me." So if my book was written for that one individual, it was worth it. And you know what? When my book was published, from day one, I never felt comfortable making money off of it because this was just such a personal, sacred thing. It just didn't feel right. But somehow it's made its way around the world, and it's almost complete. They've almost sold all the first edition. There might still be a few copies left at cedarfortpublishing.com. Um, I hope so. If anyone wants my story, if not, you can find it online, or you can get the ebook on Amazon, the Kindle book.
That's what I'm talking about. You know, what a difference you made in that woman's life. And I can guarantee you there was more than just that one woman. I
Oh, I'm
promise you
sure.
that. Yeah.
Someone gave me a blessing, and in my faith, and the blessing basically said there are people who have important missions to fulfill, who, you know, your story basically says that your story and what you have to share will um, give them hope. Not exactly in those words. I'm trying to paraphrase it, but so I know that those people are out there. Um, yeah. So hopefully, something that we shared today will touch somebody's
I think it will. You're also an incredible artist.
life.
I see
So
some paintings behind you. Are those some of your
yeah,
work?
yeah. I don't know if this will show you.
It does.
They're all backwards, but uh, yeah, I do that pretty much every day. That's what I eat, drink, and sleep.
Did you ever try to recreate something that you saw in your experience?
I get asked that all the time. You know what? Because we don't have the color palette here, it's impossible. But the closest I can come to that is to try to capture a spiritual quality in my work, and in particular when I try to paint an aspen tree. Uh, I try to come close, but I guarantee you it's nothing like. But if I can capture a spiritual quality, that's great. So,
If my viewers wanted to reach out to you to even just to check out your artwork or to purchase your book, or if they have more questions, how can they find you?
um, well, they can email me at russellricksart.com, or russellricks@yahoo.com. Uh, I mean, or Russell Ricks at Yahoo, excuse me. And then my Instagram is Russell Ricks _art, and that's all lowercase letters. And remember, it's two S's and two L's.
Well, just a beautiful story,
Thanks.
incredible and amazing. Words can't even describe how profound.
Now, I
This-
want to ask you, what got you into this? Did you have a near-death experience or similar?
I had a shared death experience when my husband was murdered in 2003.
Oh,
And then I, right after his death, I started having spontaneous out of body experiences. And I had those for about 15 or 16 years. I had continuous spiritual experiences on a regular basis.
after I had my experience, I remember after that, um, leaving my body and just kind of flying around. But I could never go back to heaven like I would try. But I found myself coming out of my body and and flying around, looking down and seeing the world below me and so on. That happened several times, but for a few years, and then I haven't had that since. But
Yeah. It's like there's a door that's opened. Once it's open, then it stays open for a little while.
yeah,
And it can take a very traumatic experience to open that door, but
yeah,
it doesn't go right back to being shut. It stays open.
yeah. And they say that it you don't have to die to have this experience, but a traumatic experience can trigger a near death like experience, and that happened to both you and I. Sounds like.
Definitely. Yes, it
Yep.
did. Well, it's been an amazing pleasure and an honor to spend this time with you today, Russell. Thank you so much for being my
As well.
guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you being here and supporting my channel. If you haven't already subscribed, please consider subscribing if you enjoy near death experiences and other spiritually transformative stories. It helps the algorithm know that this information is useful and push it out to more people. And that's the goal, to get as many people to know that we are eternal spiritual beings and that we never die. Our bodies might die, but our essence will never die. And I want people to live with less fear. Let's all spread the word. Like, comment, subscribe, share, hit that little notification bell so you get all the notifications when my videos post. Thank you for all of your support. I'm sending love to you.